I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as the Signal chat group data breach controversy continues, we look at the supposed Black Sea deal, which has been interpreted very differently by Ukraine and Russia, and we ask whether or not Donald Trump cut a secret deal with Putin behind closed doors. Later, we return to the critical subject of how Europe can support Ukraine even if the US withdraws.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 26th of March, 3 years and 31 days since the full-scale invasion began, and today I'm joined by the Executive Editor for Audio, Francis Dearnley, and former tank unit commander and chemical and biological weapon expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. First, the latest from the military and diplomatic fronts. There are two big stories today, folks. Firstly, the outcome of those negotiations over a Black Sea ceasefire. The bluff, military language, bottom line up front, is the White House readouts of the Trump administration's deal with Russia and Ukraine, or deals with Russia and Ukraine, differ in one very significant way, and that's before we get to Russia's interpretation of the deal. Now, Francis is going to be dealing with that shortly. The second story today that I'm going to lead on is the continued fallout from the security breach related to the Signal app group chat. There was extraordinary testimony given yesterday by Tulsi Gabbard and John Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA, to the Senate Intelligence Committee. I'm going to be dealing with that after the military updates, of which next to no movement in the lines in Ukraine and Russia. Very minor Ukrainian advances in the Belgorod region of Russia, as we were discussing yesterday, and small Russian advances in the vicinity of Orikhiv, that's in Zaporizhia Oblast, about 50 k's southeast of Zaporizhia city. So next to no movement, but it still resulted in 1,280 Russian casualties. Those figures come from Ukraine's general staff. Now, at least 4 people were killed and 6 others injured across Ukraine as a result of attacks across the country yesterday. 117 drones were launched, with hits recorded in the Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, Kirovrad and Cherkasy oblasts. Regional governor of Kryvyi Rih in the Donbass said the city had endured the biggest attack of the war so far, after 12 drones were shot down there, but others did get through last night. Speaking of it on Twitter, President Zelensky said last night there were another 117 proofs in our skies of how Russia continues to drag out this war. 117 strike drones, most of them Shaheeds. Now, possibly more proof of Russia's true intentions came with an overnight drone attack on the Ukrainian Black Sea port of Mykolaiv, just hours after the apparent agreement on a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. The mayor of Mykolaiv said there were emergency power outages in the city after the strike. Look, and there is no ceasefire. This whole process is being used by Russia to stall for time and not obviously be seen to reject Donald Trump's plans. So we've just got to be very careful when we're talking about ceasefire and violations and all that kind of stuff. It's just a sham process at the moment. Dom's opinion. Next one, Russia convicted 23 captured Ukrainians on terrorism charges stemming from the war in a trial that Kyiv denounced as sham and a violation of international law. Now, the defendants included 14 current or former fighters from the Azov Brigade, which Russia has designated a terrorist group, along with 9 women and 1 man who worked as cooks or support personnel. That's according to Russian media reports and rights activists. Now, 12 defendants were not in court. 11 had returned to Ukraine in 2 previous prisoner exchanges and were convicted in absentia, and 1 other died in custody last year. All had been charged with staging a violent coup d'etat and organising activities of a terrorist organisation. They were given sentences ranging from 13 to 23 years in prison. Turning to the Signal group chat fallout. As I say, yesterday, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and CIA Director John Ratcliffe, with others, but they're the primary ones we're going to focus on, they were answering questions at a hearing into worldwide threats set up by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The signal group, the data security, related policy, all that kind of stuff was a major thread of the discussions. It was a pretty chaotic affair, basically. There was a lot of obfuscation. There were lengthy, rambling, go-nowhere points that were made just to try and soak up time. Tulsi Gabbard refused to say that she was in the chat, but also didn't deny her involvement. One of the members of the chat was called TG, the little avatar you get. She was asked outright whether or not she was the TG in the chat. She said, "I'm not going to get into the specifics." But later...
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable, Francis, yeah. But later, when asked if sensitive information had been discussed, she said there were no classified or intelligence equities that were included in that chat at any time. Okay, now, maybe she wasn't the TG in the chat, and she's just been very well briefed afterwards, but her performance was not convincing. She was repeatedly asked if there was no confidential information in the chat, why not just give it to the committee? She refused to answer. More on that shortly. Now, John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, he did confirm his presence, but he said that Signal is allowed in the CIA for, quote, permissible work use. He said the app had been loaded onto his computer at the CIA within days of his confirmation to the role. Now, I saw that and I thought that was a very political answer. It's straight out of the Russian school of misinformation. This was the divert strategy, alongside deny the information, and discredit the accuser. So divert. No one was suggesting that Signal wasn't allowed to be used by government officials. No one was suggesting that if it has been used, was a contemporaneous record taken of government officials' actions, opinions, and decisions. They were trying to get to the bottom of whether any discussion breached the security classification appropriate for that means of communication. And they're also trying to get to the bottom of how the hell a journalist was invited into the chat group. Now, just on this, Jeffrey Goldberg, the journalist in question, and Shane Harris posted an article on the Atlantic's website. Go and have a look at it. It had excerpts from the chat. They went to great pains to say in this article that yesterday they wrote to the CIA, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Council, and the White House with the following email. They said, in light of statements today, as in yesterday, from multiple administration officials, including before the Senate Intelligence Committee, that the information in the signal chain about the Houthi strike is not classified and that it does not contain war plans, the Atlantic is considering publishing the entirety of the signal chain. Now, in the article, they then write, late yesterday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt emailed a response, and her response was, as we have repeatedly stated, there was no classified information transmitted in the group chat. However, as the CIA director and the National Security Advisor have both expressed today, that does not mean we encourage the release of the conversation. This was intended to be an internal and private deliberation amongst high-level senior staff, and sensitive information was discussed. So for those reasons, yes, we object to the release. Now, the Atlantic team make the point that Caroline Leavitt, in her statement, did not address which elements of the texts the White House considered sensitive, or how, more than a week after the initial airstrikes, their publication could have a bearing on national security. So, Jeffrey Goldberg, Shane Harris, and the team at the Atlantic have published text from the conversation that took place on Saturday, March the 15th. And this conversation took place 31 minutes before the first US warplanes were launched with, I remind you, a journalist in the chat group. So at 11:44 a.m. Eastern Time, Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, posted in the chat, all in capital letters, team update. Then the text below said, time now 11:44 ET, Eastern Time. Weather is favourable, just confirmed with CENTCOM. We'll go for mission launch. CENTCOM is US Central Command covering the sort of military activities in the Middle East. Pete Hegseth then continued, 12:15 Eastern Time, F-18s launch, first strike package. 13:45, trigger-based F-18, first strike window starts. Target terrorist is at his known location, so should be on time. Also, strike drones launch, brackets MQ-9s, MQ-9 being the big Reapers. Hegseth continued. 14:10, more F-18s launch second strike package. 14:15, strike drones on target. This is when the first bombs will definitely drop, pending earlier trigger-based targets. 15:36, F-18 second strike starts. Also, first sea-based Tomahawks launched. More to follow per the timeline. We are currently clean on OPSEC, that's operational security, and then he finishes, Godspeed to our warriors. Right, shortly after that, Vice President J.D. Vance texted the group saying, I will say a prayer for victory. And at 2 p.m, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, typed, the first target, so obviously this is sometime later, but at 2 p.m, he said, the first target, their top missile guy, we had positive ID of him walking into his girlfriend's building and it's now collapsed. We're going to put a link to the Atlantic's article in the episode notes today. It might be behind a paywall, but do go and have a look at it if you can. This is definitely a security breach. They are talking about timings. They're talking about the nature of weapons. They're talking about aircraft that are going to be used, all ahead of the strike package. And that last point, that phrase, we had positive ID, as in identification, we had positive ID of him walking into his girlfriend's building. That implies they either had a team on the ground, either US or local liaison units, or they might have had some technical means. But to see their primary target going into a building, I mean, that is an operational breach. Okay. Now, by all means, come back at me for repeating this stuff and say I'm being fast and loose with operational security and I shouldn't be repeating this. I shouldn't be pointing to people in the article. But just ask yourself before you send that to me if I'm really the person that you should be having a go at right now. Okay, now I'm going to continue for a little bit longer before I hand over to Franco. Donald Trump said that this whole thing, this whole breach was, quote, the only glitch in 2 months of his administration, and the lapse turned out not to be a serious one. Mike Waltz has said he took full responsibility, although I haven't seen any resignation offer yet. And when asked on Fox News last night, he was asked the question, how did a Trump-hating editor of The Atlantic end up on your Signal chat? Mike Waltz said, you know, Laura, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but of all the people out there, somehow this guy, he's the one that somehow gets on somebody's contact and then gets sucked into the group. Which doesn't sound much like taking responsibility to me, and doesn't sound as if the United States National Security Advisor has a clue about how chat groups work. Either that, or he's just making up whatever he thinks you will believe to get himself off the hook. Now, you might believe that. You might think that that is how technology works, in which case this probably isn't the pod for you, and God's sake, don't let Gareth Caulfield hear you say that. Now, you might think this whole issue is no big deal, but let me ask you this. What if it had been Biden or Harris? What if there had been a similar glitch under old Sleepy Joe? Would you have let it go, said, no big deal, say it was just the typical work of, quote, bottom scum journalists, as the ever-classy Mr. Waltz called Jeffrey Goldberg? Was your reaction when you heard this news one of loyalty to the United States, to the idea that the handling of information relating to the security of the United States, and which could potentially impact, potentially end, the lives of American servicemen and servicewomen, should be beyond reproach, regardless of who is involved? Or was your reaction one of loyalty to Donald Trump? I'll leave that one with you. But anyway, Francis, that's me. I've been bumping my gums. That's the first story. Although I noticed at the top I said it was the second one. Hey, you do the maths. You've been looking at the Black Sea ceasefire agreement, which is not much of an agreement as far as I can tell. What have you been seeing?
Well, yes, thanks, Dom. Let's return to that subject, the one that's got lots of tongues wagging this morning. Although, as you say, there's so much confusion about what it all really means and whether there even is a deal in place. So let's look at the White House readouts first. 2 were released last night, one of the outcomes of the discussions with the Russians and the other with the Ukrainians. The first stated as follows. The US and Russia have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. The US will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. More on that big one in a moment. The US and Russia agreed to develop measures for implementing an agreement to ban strikes against energy facilities of Russia and Ukraine. The US and Russia welcome the good offices of third countries with a view towards supporting the implementation of the energy and maritime agreements. The US and Russia will continue working toward achieving durable and lasting peace. So that was the readout with the Russians and the United States. The readout from the US from the conversations with the Ukrainian team features the same wording with regards to agreeing safe navigation in the Black Sea, a ban on infrastructure strikes and on third parties, but excludes all references to Russia's restored access to those markets. The only addition is as follows. The US and Ukraine agreed that the US remains committed to helping achieve the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. Now, you'll already be able to tell what's going on here, but just you wait until you hear the details from Moscow's own readout, which is even more serious. That reveals lifting sanctions restrictions from the Russian Agricultural Bank and other financial organisations involving in ensuring operations on international trade in food and fertilisers, connecting them to SWIFT, opening the necessary correspondent accounts, and lifting restrictions on trade finance operations. In other words, this deal means US sanctions on Russia would be theoretically lifted, ostensibly only for those sanctions impacting food travelling through the Black Sea. But, and it's a big but, in such a way that as long as agriculture, fertilisers or fishing are in the portfolio of any sanctioned banks or companies, they have a case for them being lifted. Moscow's readout goes on also to include a ban on strikes against energy infrastructure in Russia and Ukraine for a period of 30 days, starting 18th of March, with the possibility of extension or withdrawal from the agreement in case of non-compliance by either side.
So that's energy infrastructure, not energy and infrastructure.
That's what it says, Dom. That's what it says.
All right, thank you.
Now, bear in mind, the vast majority of strikes now by the Ukrainians into Russia are on what might be dubbed energy infrastructure, providing money and material for Russia's war effort, whereas the Russians are more inclined to target cities and military targets in Ukraine. So again, it will be Russia that benefits more from such an agreement in real terms, given that precise wording, energy infrastructure. Now, as one Ukrainian MP writes, this means Russia will continue targeting Ukrainian cities under the pretense of striking military facilities, while Ukraine will be restricted from launching deep strikes against Russian oil refineries and depots. If Ukraine does carry out such strikes, the US will likely halt weapons shipments again. They go on. It's a complete betrayal negotiated behind Ukraine's back when we declared willingness for a complete ceasefire. Concessions were granted to Russia while Ukraine received nothing. The only supposed benefit, security for trade in the Black Sea, is misleading at best. Ukraine had already achieved that independently over a year ago by disabling or sinking a dozen Russian warships that had been targeting civilian merchant vessels. Framing this so-called agreement as a win for safe shipping is just a smokescreen. In reality, Ukraine secured that safety through force. Now, that's a really important point she makes. It makes sense for Russia to prioritise making strategic gains in the Black Sea, as it was a theatre that they've almost been entirely defeated in. Could this open the door for Russian warships to return there?
I will try and answer that shortly.
OK. Well, former naval commander Captain Tom Sharp, who has appeared on the podcast several times, has just written a piece for us at the Telegraph titled "Putin is beaten in the Black Sea." Of course he wants a ceasefire there. And he underscores that there is a danger here that this will lead to a shift in the direction of warships to eventually be allowed back into the Black Sea. We'll have a link in the show notes to that piece. Now, it's noteworthy that Ukraine has said today that movement of Russian warships outside the eastern part of the Black Sea will constitute a violation of this deal. But Moscow has already countered, saying that this deal will only come into force after sanctions are lifted against Russian agriculture and fertilizer exports, which has seemingly been agreed by Washington. Indeed, there is, as I said earlier on, major uncertainty this morning as to whether this agreement has come into effect for that reason. But as many have pointed out, why would anyone lift any sanctions on Russia before Russia has proven it will abide by any kind of ceasefire? Fundamentally, it would seem Ukraine has been misled in these talks. Kyiv is saying that they didn't agree to any sanctions relief for Russia as a condition for any ceasefire. Andrei Sybiha, Kyiv's Minister for Foreign Affairs, who was in those talks, has put out a statement saying as follows: "Unfortunately, we can already see Russia attempting to manipulate and condition agreements on sanctions relief or anything else. But this is only reflected in Russia's own statements. Russia always lies, but now it will be especially visible for the entire world if Putin will continue to prolong the war. Pressure is the only cure for Russian lies." Now, I'll talk later on about the latest on the Russian economy in the context of what options Europe has, but I think we need to see this, Dom, for what it is, an attempt to grant concessions to the Russians in the hope that it will eventually lead to a permanent ceasefire. But concessions which will seriously hamper Ukraine's recent successes.
I just need a pause there, Francis, because we talked about the Black Sea. In the article from Tom Sharp, he talks about the Montreux Convention. Folks may have heard of this before. It is a little bit wonkish, but let's just have a very brief dive into, no pun intended, dive into the what this is and why it's so important. So, the Montreux Convention, technically the Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits, signed in 1936, gives Turkey control over the water route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and therefore the rest of the world. Now, Turkey, under this convention, UN-recognised convention, can close the straits to belligerent parties in wartime, so that the warring parties can't go in and out of the Black Sea willy-nilly. Turkey can also close the straits to commercial shipping of the belligerent parties. There's a load of other bits and pieces, not that many actually. Do go and have a look at it. It's not that long. But essentially there are limits on the use of submarines, how belligerent parties can send submarines in. There's also limits on the number of ships allowed in. For example, it says no group of ships may exceed 15,000 metric tons. And bearing in mind that modern ships are pretty big old heavy beasts, a frigate is about 3,000 metric tons, destroys about 3 times that lot. So 15,000 is not much at all. So Turkey is a very central actor here, and the access to and from the Black Sea is of huge importance, not only for this deal but for the war as a whole, as we've seen. Ukraine without a navy has effectively defeated Russia's Black Sea fleet. So Russia would love to get the straits opened and get more warships in there. So Turkey is a central actor, but obvious there's huge political turmoil in Turkey right now with the arrest of the opposition leader. So President Erdogan may seek to use his influence over the Montreux Convention to gain political advantage elsewhere with EU allies and the UN and NATO and all this kind of stuff. So do keep an eye on Turkey, and the specific references to the Montreux Convention, access to and from the Black Sea, whether or not the convention is going to be lifted and allow free access, which Russia would love. Turkey will, I'm sure, seek to make political gain from this. Right. Thank you, Francis. Now, that whole Black Sea deal, or deals, plural, the controversy around them speaks of the need for Europe to do much more. So what's the latest on that front?
Yes, so let's get into another subject that's pivotal at the moment. Many are arguing that realistically only European states can help Ukraine now, given the shift in direction taking place in the United States, and that they need to be active and fast. I think it's important to frame this conversation correctly. Ukraine is not without cards. Serhiy Kuzan, chairman of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center, who I interviewed in Kyiv about a year ago, has written a piece for the Atlantic Council which underscores Ukraine's growing military strength and how it's an underrated factor in these peace talks. In 2025, the overall capacity of Ukraine's defense industry is expected to reach a new high of $35 billion, up from just $1 billion at the onset of the full-scale invasion. It is also a drone superpower. Likewise, as underscored in a piece published by the Financial Times today, Russia's Gazprom, the gas and oil company, is struggling to recover from record losses after the invasion destroyed its business model. Similarly, the Moscow Times reported only 3 hours ago that Russia's second largest oil producer reported a 26.5% drop in net profit for 2024. The Russian economy is far from healthy. So let's start there with the economy. As The Economist magazine underscores, if America lifts sanctions, it is possible Europe will decide to keep its own in place. There's been some evidence this morning, I should add, that that would remain true. Some geopolitical pundits assume that it wouldn't matter much. Access to America's tech, currency and payment networks, they say, is what Russia really wants. But our analysis, this is The Economist, suggests this is wrong. Without Europe on side, Russia's trade, access to payment systems and foreign investment would all remain severely limited. Take trade first. Ending American sanctions would revive good trade between the two countries, which shrank by 90% from 2021 to 2024. Even before the invasion, however, such trade was worth only a relatively meagre $35 billion. Any rebound would be equally modest. By contrast, Russia's pre-war trade with the EU was worth 258 billion euros. If Europe stayed the course, that would not come back. Lifting sanctions on energy exports would not provide much of an extra boost either. Most of the Russian central bank's assets are in Europe and would presumably stay frozen. Most Russian banks would still be cut off from SWIFT, which is based in Belgium. So that's The Economist, and that piece, which we'll link to in the show notes along with all the pieces we cited today, underscores that Europe has considerable leverage even if American sanctions end. But let's look next at weapons procurement. Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute has written a fascinating new report on this, where he concludes that Europe has the latent capacity to produce much of the material that Ukraine requires to fend off Russia, but it has not prepared effectively to shoulder this burden. Don't we know it, Jack? It can replace the US as Ukraine's primary security provider, but doing so will take time, require difficult collaboration and be costly. Although those hurdles are real, they are not insurmountable. Embarking upon this undertaking, however, is likely to transform Europe's relations with the US. In short, even where Europe cannot compensate for the US, such as certain advanced weapons systems, the consequences need not be catastrophic. He goes on. The US now faces an important choice. If it supports and enables the regeneration of Europe's defence industrial base and does not obstruct Europe's support for Ukraine, then the US could achieve its objective of helping Europe manage its own defence and security, allowing Washington to fulfil its long-standing goal of redistributing forces to the Indo-Pacific. But for decades, US defence industrial policy toward Europe has instead aimed at balkanising and undermining Europe's own defence industry to encourage US foreign military sales on the continent. If the US tries to force a process of European rearmament by compelling European countries to buy more US-made weapons, it will not be successful because of distrust. What is unknown, Jack writes, is whether the US will obstruct Europe or merely let it get on with it. To quote him, "It is one thing for the US to insist that it will not spend on new equipment for Ukraine, but quite another for it to stop maintaining or providing spare parts for equipment already in use. The US could forbid European states from purchasing the relevant spare parts and sending them to Ukraine. Ukraine's armed forces currently have approximately 4,000 pieces of military equipment awaiting repair. Europe over time, though, can transition Ukraine's military to systems it can support without US help. But if the US moves aggressively to prevent the maintenance of equipment already given, then Europe will be powerless to arrest the steady demechanization of the Ukrainian military. Jack then goes on to underscore that the EU will need to look past ideological challenges, working with Britain and Norway more closely, for instance, but also removing self-imposed barriers. The Telegraph reported this week that EU rules on ethical investing are blocking almost £100 billion of funding from flowing into the defence industry. Jack concludes by saying only if Europe can rationalise supply chains across the continent and achieve economies of scale in defence production will it have the capacity to meet Ukraine's needs. Under the current system, in which countries compete with one another for parts and supplies, Europe will fail. Consider artillery ammunition. In 2023, Ukraine received approximately 1.6 million 155mm artillery rounds from its international partners, including the US. In 2024, Ukraine received approximately 1.5 million rounds. Analysts believe Ukraine needs 2.4 million rounds per year to prevent further Russian advances. That disparity seems to suggest that without US supply, Europe cannot sufficiently back Ukraine at present. The fundamental question underpinning Europe's ability to shoulder the burden of its security beyond the extent to which this effort is actively obstructed by US policy is will. It is up to the Europeans to determine whether they can stomach the costs, but they should not hide behind the claim that they cannot defend Ukraine without the US. Much depends, however, on whether the US wants that transition to take place. So Jack Watling there. Europe has options, Dom. The Black Sea ceasefire proposal is yet further evidence of the direction of travel, the US withdrawing from the war. Europe surely needs to act accordingly.
It does. Thanks, Francis. I want to get a bit of a sort of sense check here. You know, we sort of live in amongst this stuff. It can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming. Are we making too much of it? And so I need for my to polish my moral compass. There's an image for you. I'll turn to Hamish DBG. Hamish, I'd like to ask you mainly through Chem Bio stuff in Syria, but you've been much closer. You've watched the Russians negotiate, not necessarily face to face, but negotiate through trying to change facts on the ground, shall we say. And also, separately, related, as a unit commander and a former British Army officer, you've handled OPSEC, operational security. You know when and where discussions should take place and on which platforms, etc., etc. So, you know, can you give us a sense check, please, Hamish? How, Francis and I dialing in, are we getting this right, or are we overplaying it? How serious are these things that we've been discussing? And any comment about Russia's negotiation strategy, because I think that's what all this is about, would be most welcome. Welcome back, Hamish.
Hi, Dom. Francis, excellent to be with you guys. And let me put a slightly different perspective on this. I've sort of operated in military intelligence and other intelligence for a whole host of time, and perhaps give a slightly different perspective. And also, I'll give a couple of quotes that I've had over the last 24 hours, but very specifically on the sort of leak. Now, I was operating in Syria sort of 5 years ago now, but setting up an early warning system for civilians for air raid attack from the Russians and the Syrians. And we were communicating originally using Signal. Now, that became compromised and we stopped using it. And this is the communications app that we're all talking about. So the fact that it was used for such confidential means is absolutely shocking. You know, the potential issues here and the damage, many, many times we've talked about the Five Eyes community, Five Eyes intelligence community, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And, you know, over the last sort of 24, 48 hours, both ourselves and the Canadians have taken a real hammering and battering from this intelligence leak. And in fact, somebody on one of my groups, I might say it's not Signal, said to me, it was an incompetence leavened with malignity. Now, I had to look up malignity. It means intense ill will. And that is the view of people who know about these things, of the leak and the potential damage it's doing. But when it comes on to the other elements, and I know the last time I was with you last week or the week before, the piece that I wrote in the paper was really Putin has absolutely no interest in peace. When you take the last 24 hours into account, it sort of underwrites that position that he has. And as you guys have both been saying, the shaping of the battlefield, if you like, has really just encouraged him. If we wind back to sort of 10 days ago when the requirements for a ceasefire were being negotiated by the Americans and the Russians predominantly, Ukrainians were brought in as well. Let's not forget what Putin was saying. His requirements for a ceasefire was the complete integration of 4 oblasts into Russia as well as Crimea. Now, you've discussed it many times. Russia does not own all of those oblasts at the moment. So, in effect, it would mean giving up even more land. Only today, the Russians have said they have absolutely no intention of handing over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, which currently they control. That is theft. That is absolutely criminal. So when you look at that and you look at the Black Sea deal and you look at Witkoff, the man at this, not exactly at the centre of the leak, but just off to the side of it. And as Ben Wallace says, when he was in Moscow the other day, saying he actually thought Putin was quite a good chap and he trusted him intently. But of course, everything we've been discussing is 180 degrees to that. And even the Black Sea ceasefire that should have come into play, Russia overnight, attacked a port in the Black Sea. So you can't believe the EU today has sort of grown a pair at last and said that stopping sanctions are off the table. And also the head of NATO's in Poland today, again, starting to being bellicose towards Russia. But going back to your original question, Dom, in this environment, intelligence is so very important and operational security is so very important. I don't think anybody can argue that stuff included in that signal message that's leaked was anything but critical intelligence. When you're planning military operations, the last thing you need is for the enemy to know what you're going to do. But of course, when you look at the information that's been published, and particularly Hexketh, talking about pathetic Europe and bailing that out again, and the inference from what he said is that, we're not going to bail them out again. We're not going to come charging over the Atlantic. If you're Putin sat in the Kremlin, not only do you now have access to Witkoff's mobile phone, because I think everybody in this sort of intelligence world knows that, if you're going to an important meeting, you switch off your phone quite a long time before you attend the meeting and you switch it back on quite a long time after, because it is an open book. One assumes that Witkoff took his phone to Moscow the other day. So basically, the Russians will know sort of everything that is on it. So I think it is you guys, I think, have got it absolutely right. Some of the bluff and bluster and downright lies coming out of some of Trump's teams, really is, I think in this side of the pond, certainly those people in the military, the intelligence services and others, it is just incredulous. It's making a really difficult situation, virtually impossible. But what is clear is it's really up to us now, us being, the UK and our friends in Europe. I believe Ms. Rees has just announced 2.2 billion extra to defence, and the rest of Europe seems to be galvanising itself. But my final piece sort of on this is I don't think there is any indication at all at the moment, with particularly what Trump and his close associates are doing, will lead Putin to any conclusion at all, except the fact that he should crack on with what he's doing, because there is nothing, certainly from the US, that is going to stop him. So I think it's a really challenging, really difficult situation. And for the people in Ukraine who are, almost on the periphery here, it's really, really demoralizing. But let's hope that Europe now has really woken up. And if that was Trump's only a main aim, then fair enough. But let's not forget that Putin seems to hold the cards at the moment. First of all, he wanted to completely subjugate Ukraine back into Russia. And secondly, he wanted to decouple Europe from the States. And if you read that, the transcript of that signal note that we all did yesterday, if I was Putin, I would think that second aim is doing pretty well. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Sorry. Hey, well, thank you, Francis. I mean, he's looking delightful in front of me, folks. Nice white shirt, crisp sort of, what's that, kind of a paisley tie type thing going on there?
Yeah, vintage 60s, don't you know?
Is it? Oh, okay, great. So thank you, Francis. And Hamish, thank you for your contribution. I note, as a freeloading European who only lost, thankfully, single-digit numbers of close friends in Iraq and Afghanistan killed as we were freeloading, doing all that kind of jazz. Cheers. Who was it? Vance? Hegseth? Can't remember. Hegseth. Right, well, thank you for... Yeah, I can only apologise for me and my freeloading chums turning two. Anyway, Hamish, you're a little bit closer to the corridors of power than either myself or Mr. Natty Tie over here. If it's not indelicate, can you show a bit of ankle? What's the chat happening at the moment? Is this idea that Europe's got to step up? Do you think it's landing? What doors have you been listening to lately in the corridors of power?
I think there is a bit of an awakening. Whatever political colour we are, I think that actually, Keir Starmer's got it. He does understand, and I think Healy has got it as well. And Ms. Reeves gets hit from every quarters, but it's usually the Treasury that is the screw that tightens around defence. But it's been released. I think there is a real reality that the threat is there. It's really there. And I think people are beginning to realise that the US, I say an unreliable ally, they are not that backstop that we have thought they were for the last 75 years. And people are suddenly going, yeah, crikey, we need to wake up to this. And there is nothing that Putin is saying that will reassure us at all. He is cracking on. I mean, but I think people are really beginning to understand that, unless we do something, we are walking into a car crash with the Russians, and a car crash that at the moment, our car's a bit wobbly, and we really need to build that up and bolster it. And, we have that peace dividend. We have flipping taken it and spent it, so completely that actually Ashchurch, which is the great store where all our kit is kept away for a rainy day, kit in there is a bit knackered and there's not a lot of it. So I think there is this sudden realization that it is a bit emperor's clothes in the other direction. We are bare, and actually we need to do something about it because we just can't afford not to. So it's really reassuring that actually our European friends are doing the same. Even the Germans are looking for 200 billion, even them realizing and have voted to change their way of doing things so that they can go onto a front foot perspective. And I think it's reassuring to look at our new Scandinavian NATO allies, like the Finns and the Swedes, who have absolutely got this. Now, is it going to be too late? Who knows? As psychology is 10-to-1 the physical in warfare and in strategic environments like this. It's something that, unfortunately, Trump and his brilliant businessmen and real estate people who are now trying to conduct political and military negotiations just don't seem to understand. It is absolutely crucial that we try and negotiate from a position of strength. Because my final bit on this is, as we've said so often, Putin exploits weakness and respects strength. And I think finally the penny's dropped and we're moving in the right direction.
So, folks, as we always say here, don't always take our word for it. Go and have a look around, see what other people are saying, and make your own minds up. So if you do want to go and have a look at supporting evidence for things that we've been opining on today, just very briefly, it won't take long. They are quite short. So have a look at the White House website and you'll find the statement straight away. They're right at the top of the briefings and statements page, or the briefings and statements documents, whatever it is. But one of the tabs, briefings and statements. Have a look at the wording of that US deal with Russia. Have a look at the wording of the US deal with Ukraine. Then go and look for the Kremlin readout of what they think they have signed up to with the, or not signed, but agreed with the United States, and make up your own mind. See if you think it's a good deal or even a good way of conducting negotiations. And then have a little break, because it's been a day of undiluted diet of red meat. Have a little break and then have a look at that Atlantic article, or at least online you'll be able to find excerpts of the text that I've been referring to. Have a look at the text about the airstrikes that had yet to happen when they were discussing them. And again, make up your own mind. Take a view on whether discussing detail like timings and weapons on an unclassified platform was a responsible thing to do, regardless of whether or not there's a journalist in the room. Go and have a look at those things. And then let me know what you think. And let me know if you think my comment about that phrase, we've had positive idea of him walking into his girlfriend's building. If you think my comment was irresponsible, please have a go at me on that if you wish. But, if you want to have a go at me about that, start your email with the words, I'm happy sensitive information is discussed on insecure channels because... ... And then you can have a go at me. Okay, Francis, what do you got? Final thoughts?
Well, thanks, Don. I know I've spoken a lot today, but I hope you'll forgive me this. Last week, one of the most significant intelligence operatives of the 20th century passed away at the age of 86. Oleg Gordievsky was that double agent who turned against the KGB to work for MI6 during the Cold War. It was he who warned the West that Moscow genuinely believed the US and its allies were preparing a preemptive nuclear strike in the 1980s, an insight that may have averted catastrophe. He also alerted British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to the reformist potential of Mikhail Gorbachev, shaping Western perceptions of that Soviet leader. His story is nothing short of extraordinary. For anyone unfamiliar with it, I highly recommend Ben McIntyre's unputdownable account, The Spy and the Traitor. It's a book that David loved too. McIntyre shared his reflections in the Sunday Times last week, writing, Gordievsky was motivated overwhelmingly by ideology. A free thinker in a society that punished freedom of thought, he became convinced that the communist system was barbaric, illiberal and wrong. He was fighting for the wrong side and needed to do whatever he could to destroy it. He arrived at this conclusion alone, without external persuasion. For 11 years, he worked for MI6 in the greatest peril, knowing that if he slipped up or he was exposed, he would be arrested, tortured and killed. The last time I saw him, he was sat on his sofa, drinking red wine and smoking a stubbly pipe. I remember asking him if he feared retribution from Putin's Russia. He curled his lip. Fear was not really part of his personality. As we sat there, an urban fox wandered into the back garden. Gordievsky pointed to it. His face lit up and his eyes brightened. And he said something in Russian we couldn't catch. He loved the foxes. Small symbols of rebellious liberty roaming the suburban landscape. The pantheon of world-changing spies is tiny, but Gordievsky is in it, somewhere near the top. The most solitary man I've ever met, and the bravest. Now, since I read that passage a few days ago, I haven't been able to shake that image of the old Cold War spy silently observing the fox with approval. And last night I realised why. Many of you will be familiar with Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox, in which he categorises writers and thinkers into two types of people. Hedgehogs, who interpret the world through the lens of a single defining idea, much like the hedgehog who relies solely on its spikes for survival. And foxes, who draw on a vast array of experiences and resist reducing the complexity of the world to one singular concept. These hedgehogs, Berlin suggests, often drift towards totalitarianism, while foxes, by contrast, embrace diversity, embrace adaptability, and embrace freedom. In this light, Gordievsky's life demonstrates that even under the most oppressive regimes, not everyone is corrupted. It reminds us that each of us face moral choices and that the courage of any individual who stands up against evil can make a profound difference. In these dark times, it's more important than ever we don't forget that.
Thanks, Francis. Certainly is. Hamish, channeling your inner fox. What have you got for us?
Thanks very much, guys. Just reference my last answer. I know that a lot of senior people in Whitehall and Westminster and other significant buildings around London listen to this podcast. And if I get any reaction, maybe next time I'm on, I will let you know what it is. But my final thought, it's not really a final thought, it's an advert, if it were. Next Thursday, the 3rd of April, the Tank Museum in Bovington in Dorset, it's the largest collection of tanks in the world, is opening its Ukraine exhibition hall. I had a preview last week and it is absolutely amazing. So I know that a lot of listeners have been to the Tank Museum or are thinking about going after next Thursday. Do go and see it. It is amazing. I will hopefully be linking in to you guys for the podcast on Thursday the 3rd from the Tank Museum and interviewing some really significant and interesting people from Ukraine, from the UK MOD and others who have been involved in supporting, particularly from an armoured vehicle perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, I must say, well worth going and looking at the Tank Museum. Been refurbed a couple of years ago. It's now absolutely brilliant. Get the train to Wool down in Dorset, and then it's a short walk from there. If you go too far, you end up in Monkey World, which is nothing to do with the Royal Military Police. Don't worry about that. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.